The webinar is structured into 6 parts. First, I will give a very brief overview on the challenges in global software engineering, or GSE as we call. I should also underline that this is not only about software development, but also about service delivery in a global context or in a distributed context. I will do the rewards and challenges, obviously focusing more on the challenges. What are the prerequisites for getting started, for making a success? I will then, from our experiences, show a top 10 list of typical risks in distributed project and some mitigation activities, or if you want, some countermeasures that these risks would not become problems, and will then summarize with some takeaways and perspectives for your own project work. The situation in distributed projects is mostly that we have on the one side a big emphasis on cost reduction, on efficiency, on utilizing flexible access to skills worldwide. But on the other side, we also know that a lot of these distributed projects suffer extremely from insufficient preparation and operation. And as a rule of thumb, we see that 20% are cancelled almost right away, while half downstream due to not reaching objectives. Now, in most cases, the root cause is both exaggerated objectives, because you always will face a learning curve, but on the same side also insufficient preparation and handling. So we will look on these topics in the course of this webinar. Now, a good starting point, which I would briefly ask each of you, is that you very spontaneously note down 3 topics where you see in your own distributed projects or teams or just set up in your company what you want to get addressed today, because that makes then the learning much easier than if you would just listen. So take a brief time and a pen and note down 3 topics where you want to get answers. At the end of the webinar, you don't have the answers, feel free then to ask questions or send me a mail afterwards. I believe that we have now these 3 topics addressed, and you have written it down, and then we are going to proceed with the webinar. And as I say, you just ask questions afterwards, and I would hope that some of your challenges will be answered in the course of this webinar. I will proceed now to the rewards and challenges, just to have some baseline. And one obvious reasoning for globally distributed project historically is the difference in labor cost. Now, the interesting part with this reasoning is that also it is mostly, let's say, emphasized. It is not really the biggest leverage. So if you look to labor cost and see about a third, when I go back 5 years, it was almost half of the projects, because people would simply look towards what's the cost per hour or cost per day in my own country and what's the cost per hour or day in another country. And then they would say, well, why don't we go global? And I ran into a lot of senior managers who actually get trapped into this one-dimensional looking into labor cost rather than a more holistic view. I should also say that labor cost differences are almost never really monetarized. I mean, that's a basic finding. I will come back to the reality in a moment. For that reason, other dimensions have recently grown very fast, because people realize that the focus on labor costs will not deliver and is too one-dimensional. So today, we see primarily the access to talent and skills, given that our IT world lacks a lot of resources, which we just cannot find anymore in our home base. But it is also the flexibility in terms of flexible access to people, be it now in terms of access at different time slots, which allows, for instance, a follow the sun approach, or approach where you would have people working at different time slots around the hour, but also the flexibility in access to skills which you would then only utilize for a given time. For instance, if you need some architecture experts in embedded systems in your software project, which you would find in Russia, you would go for them for, let's say, 3 months, and then once this part of the project is finished, you would then also slow down the access. And these are possibilities which today are fairly easy to handle with all the collaboration tools which we have, but a couple of years ago would not have been feasible. So we see a clear move in the reasoning, have into talent and skills, flexibility. To a lower degree, it is quality cycle time, and also growing local market access. If companies want to be present in China, for instance, obviously they increasingly move their product development also into China. Is not anymore the case that a pure service team in a country would be sufficient for big markets. With their own local needs, it is useful to have also local workforce in the product development, for the very simple reason that these people have a much better understanding of the needs in these markets than you would have if you just work from one central place. And I think we have now observed that in many companies this pattern is dominating the initial labor cost focus. Reality has it, and you see that in the red bar, that the cost reduction is in the range of 10 to 20%. In development, you might achieve much more in services, but for software development, for distributed projects, you have a 10 to 20% cost reduction after a 2-year learning curve. That's the rule of thumb. Some might do better, specifically, for instance, if you work in the same time zone, so that you have really overlapping team time. For instance, I saw that between the United States and Brazil, being in almost the same time zone will help a lot. That's true in a way that you then have a better efficiency, you have less frictions, you have less ping pong, as we call it, between sites, but that's the rather exception case. Otherwise, it is, in terms of cost reduction, still a big lever. If you think about 20% productivity improvement, that's a huge amount given the global competition which we have in our products, but it is still better to also look to the other dimensions which I just mentioned. The challenge side, what we see is a couple of additional cost factors which kind of balance the initial cost per hour benefits which you might have seen by looking just to the wages. And one is certainly just the cost of learning curve to start making your processes accessible and usable for globally distributed projects, but also for instance, building up the right tools environment. In many companies, for instance, I see that the whole IT infrastructure is just not sufficient for globalization. Now, if you have a supplier in the IT domain, like the big Indian suppliers like Wipro, Tata, or Infosys, they are used to handling this. But if you work with other companies or you have a captive or in-house distributed development, you will soon face that your